Good evening. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on a surveillance story that stretches from the battlefields of the Middle East to the ballot boxes of America. Two stories, one common thread: governments weaponizing intelligence capabilities against the very people they claim to protect.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight's investigations are the kind that keep national security analysts up at night. We're talking about a confirmed Russian-Iranian intelligence pipeline that could put American service members in the crosshairs, and a domestic surveillance apparatus that has grown so powerful it now poses a direct threat to the integrity of our own elections.
We need to be clear from the top: these are not conspiracy theories. These are sourced, verified reports from some of the most credible investigative outlets in the world. Al Jazeera's reporting on the Russia-Iran intelligence axis, and the Intercept's deep investigation into how ICE and the Department of Homeland Security have built what amounts to a national police force with staggering surveillance reach.
And Alex, what ties these stories together is a question every citizen should be asking: who is actually watching whom, and for whose benefit? When intelligence flows between adversaries to target American troops, and when domestic agencies turn their surveillance tools inward toward voters, we are looking at a fundamental crisis of accountability.
So buckle in. This is Truth Report, and tonight we follow the surveillance trail wherever it leads. Let's start overseas.
Our first story comes from Al Jazeera, reporting today, March 7, 2026. Multiple sources indicate that Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence specifically designed to help Tehran identify and strike American military assets in the region. And here's the critical detail: the Pentagon is actively downplaying these reports.
Let's break down what we know. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, this isn't a vague accusation. We're talking about operational intelligence, the kind of targeting data that tells you where assets are positioned, what their movement patterns look like, and when they're most vulnerable. Russia, a country that possesses some of the most sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities on the planet, allegedly funneling that information directly to Iranian military planners.
And Alex, the Pentagon's response here is telling. Rather than issuing a forceful denial or demanding accountability, U.S. defense officials are asserting that American forces are simply tracking Russian-Iranian operations. Think about what that language means. They're not saying it isn't happening. They're saying they're watching it happen.
That's the key distinction, Maya. Tracking is not countering. Tracking is not preventing. The Pentagon is essentially confirming awareness of a hostile intelligence pipeline aimed at American troops while simultaneously telling the public not to worry about it. That is a stunning posture for a defense establishment to take.
Let's talk about the geopolitical architecture behind this. Russia and Iran have been deepening their military cooperation for years, accelerated dramatically since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Iran supplied drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. Now, according to these reports, Russia may be returning the favor, not with hardware, but with something potentially more dangerous: actionable intelligence on American force positioning.
And this is where the surveillance angle becomes critical. Russia's intelligence capabilities, from satellite reconnaissance to signals intelligence to cyber operations, are world-class. When you combine Russian collection capabilities with Iranian operational willingness to confront American forces, you create a threat multiplication effect that should alarm every military planner in the Pentagon.
The question we have to ask is, why would the U.S. downplay this? If a nuclear-armed adversary is feeding targeting data to a regional power that has repeatedly attacked American interests, that should be front-page, 5-alarm news. The fact that the Pentagon is choosing to characterize this as something they're merely monitoring suggests political calculations are overriding operational security.
There are several possible explanations, none of them comforting. First, the administration may not want to escalate tensions with Russia at a time when multiple diplomatic channels are strained. Acknowledging that Russia is actively helping Iran target American troops would demand a response: sanctions, military repositioning, diplomatic consequences, that the current political leadership may not want to undertake.
Second, and this is the darker reading, there may be a recognition that the U.S. intelligence community's own surveillance operations in the region have been compromised. If Russia knows enough about American force positions to share that intelligence with Iran, it implies a significant counterintelligence failure. Downplaying the story could be an attempt to avoid admitting that failure publicly.
And third, we have to consider the domestic political dimension. Admitting that an adversary is helping another adversary target your troops while you do nothing about it is politically devastating. The tracking language gives the Pentagon plausible deniability: we knew, we were watching, we had it under control, even if the reality is far more chaotic.
What's particularly alarming is the escalation pattern this represents. We've moved from Russia and Iran cooperating on weapons transfers to cooperating on intelligence sharing specifically targeting American military personnel. That is a qualitative leap in the threat level, and the muted response from Washington should concern every American with a family member in uniform.
Let's also consider what this means for the broader intelligence landscape. If Russia is willing to share targeting intelligence with Iran against the United States, what other intelligence partnerships are forming outside of public view? Are we looking at the emergence of an adversarial intelligence sharing network that mirrors, or counters, the Five Eyes alliance?
That's a critical question. The Five Eyes arrangement between the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand has been a cornerstone of Western intelligence cooperation for decades. If Russia, Iran, and potentially China are building a parallel intelligence-sharing infrastructure, the balance of surveillance power globally could shift in ways that fundamentally alter American security.
And the people who pay the price for these intelligence failures and political calculations are always the same, the service members deployed in harm's way who rely on their government to take threats seriously, not to manage them for political convenience.
Now let's turn to our second story, and this one hits even closer to home. The Intercept published a major investigation yesterday detailing how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and the broader Department of Homeland Security have constructed surveillance capabilities so vast and so unchecked that they now pose a genuine threat to the integrity of American elections.
Let me set the stage here. When the Department of Homeland Security was created after September 11, it was sold to the American public as a necessary response to terrorism. 25 years later, DHS has metastasized into something its architects may never have intended, or perhaps exactly what some of them did intend. A sprawling domestic surveillance and enforcement apparatus with virtually no meaningful oversight.
The Intercept's reporting focuses on a specific and terrifying capability. DHS, through ICE and its component agencies, has built what amounts to a national police force with massive surveillance infrastructure. We're talking about access to license plate readers that track the movements of millions of Americans, facial recognition databases, social media monitoring tools, cell phone location data purchased from commercial brokers, all without the warrant requirements that constrain traditional law enforcement.
And here's where it connects to elections. The Intercept's investigation raises a question that should shake every voter. What happens when an agency with these surveillance powers decides to deploy them near polling places? What happens when ICE conducts operations in immigrant communities during election season? The chilling effect on voter participation isn't a bug, it could very well be a feature.
Let's be specific about what chilling effect means in practice. In communities with mixed-status families, where U.S. citizens live alongside undocumented relatives, the presence of ICE creates terror. A citizen has every legal right to vote, but if casting that vote means driving past an ICE checkpoint, or if their voter registration data could theoretically be cross-referenced with immigration databases, many will simply stay home.
And this isn't hypothetical, Maya. We've documented cases in previous election cycles where ICE operations surged in specific communities during voting periods. The question the Intercept is raising is whether this pattern represents deliberate voter suppression, using the surveillance state's immigration enforcement arm to selectively depress turnout in communities that tend to vote in particular ways.
The surveillance tools make this exponentially more dangerous than old-fashioned voter intimidation. In the past, suppressing votes required physical presence, people standing outside polling places, demanding identification, creating an atmosphere of fear. Now, DHS can achieve the same effect through data. They can identify communities with high concentrations of non-citizens, map the surrounding citizen populations, and time enforcement actions to maximize the deterrent effect on voter turnout.
The Intercept's investigation also highlights the legislative dimension. Democrats have raised concerns about DHS and ICE reform, particularly around the agency's role in the lead-up to midterm elections. But here's the structural problem. DHS was designed to operate with minimal congressional oversight. The agency's surveillance capabilities were built incrementally, often through administrative decisions rather than legislative authorization, making them extraordinarily difficult to rein in.
And we need to talk about the data infrastructure. ICE doesn't just collect its own data. It purchases massive datasets from private companies, location data harvested from smartphone apps, utility records, financial transaction data. This creates an end run around the Fourth Amendment. The government doesn't need a warrant to buy data that Americans have technically consented to share with private companies through terms of service agreements that nobody reads.
This is the surveillance capitalism pipeline in action. Private companies collect your data for profit. The government buys that data to track you. And the constitutional protections that were supposed to prevent the government from monitoring citizens without cause simply don't apply, because a private intermediary laundered the surveillance through a commercial transaction.
The implications for elections are staggering. Consider what DHS could theoretically do with these tools. They could identify which registered voters have undocumented family members. They could track which citizens attend political rallies or protests. They could monitor social media activity to map political organizing in targeted communities. All of this is technically within the agency's existing capabilities.
And the critical question the Intercept raises is, who is ensuring these tools aren't being used for political purposes? The answer, based on their investigation, is essentially nobody. The oversight mechanisms that exist are designed for a pre-digital surveillance world. Congressional committees that are supposed to monitor DHS are understaffed, underinformed, and often ideologically sympathetic to expanding enforcement powers rather than constraining them.
Let's talk about what meaningful reform would look like, because the Intercept's reporting doesn't just identify the problem, it points toward the structural changes needed. First, there need to be explicit legal prohibitions on ICE operations within a defined radius of polling places during election periods. Not guidelines, not best practices, binding legal restrictions with enforcement mechanisms.
Second, the data purchasing loophole needs to be closed. If the government needs a warrant to place a tracking device on your car, it should need a warrant to purchase your location data from a data broker. The distinction between direct surveillance and purchase surveillance is a legal fiction that the courts have been painfully slow to address.
Third, and this is the most ambitious but most necessary reform, DHS itself needs to be fundamentally restructured. An agency that was created to fight terrorism should not have evolved into a domestic surveillance powerhouse with the ability to influence elections. The mission creep from counterterrorism to immigration enforcement to what is effectively political surveillance represents one of the most dangerous institutional transformations in modern American history.
And the political dynamics around reform are deeply challenging. Any politician who proposes constraining ICE's surveillance powers will immediately be accused of being soft on immigration or soft on security. That political trap is by design, it's how the surveillance state protects itself from democratic accountability.
Which brings us to the synthesis. Alex, we've covered two stories tonight that on the surface appear very different. One is about Russian intelligence being shared with Iran to target American military assets overseas. The other is about American intelligence agencies building surveillance infrastructure that threatens our elections at home. But the underlying pattern is the same.
You're absolutely right, Maya. In both cases, we're seeing surveillance capabilities being deployed not for their stated purpose, national security, but for strategic advantage. Russia shares intelligence with Iran not because of shared values but because it serves Moscow's interest in constraining American power. DHS expands its surveillance reach not because immigrants threaten elections but because that surveillance capability serves certain political interests.
And in both cases, the people who should be providing oversight, Congress, the Pentagon's civilian leadership, the courts, are either looking the other way or actively enabling the expansion. The Pentagon downplays the Russia-Iran intelligence pipeline because confronting it is politically inconvenient. Congress fails to constrain DHS because surveillance powers are politically useful.
This is the fundamental surveillance paradox of our era. The same capabilities that are supposed to protect us, intelligence collection, data analysis, pattern recognition, threat assessment, become the tools by which power protects itself from accountability. Whether it's a foreign adversary using surveillance data to target our troops or a domestic agency using surveillance data to suppress votes, the dynamic is identical.
And here's what makes this moment uniquely dangerous. We are living through a period of unprecedented surveillance capability. Governments can track individuals in real time across the globe. They can monitor communications, map social networks, predict behavior. These capabilities exist at a scale that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. And the legal and institutional frameworks meant to govern these powers have not kept pace.
The Russia-Iran intelligence story should be a wake-up call about what happens when surveillance capabilities are shared between actors with hostile intent. The ICE election story should be a wake-up call about what happens when surveillance capabilities are turned inward against a country's own citizens. Together, they paint a picture of a world where surveillance has become the primary currency of power, and where those without access to that currency are increasingly vulnerable.
So what can ordinary people do? First, demand transparency. When the Pentagon says it's tracking hostile intelligence operations, demand to know what that means in practice. When DHS conducts operations near polling places, demand to know the operational justification. Surveillance thrives in secrecy, sunlight remains the best disinfectant.
Second, support organizations doing the investigative work. Outlets like Al Jazeera and The Intercept are doing the journalism that holds power accountable. Without their reporting, these stories would remain buried in classified briefings and bureaucratic memoranda. Independent journalism is not a luxury, it is a critical infrastructure of democracy.
Third, engage with the political process despite the obstacles. If DHS surveillance is designed to suppress voter turnout, the most powerful act of resistance is showing up to vote. If the Pentagon is downplaying threats to avoid political consequences, the most powerful response is making those political consequences unavoidable through democratic participation.
And finally, pay attention. The surveillance state counts on public apathy, on information overload, making citizens too exhausted to track what their government is doing. Every time you read an investigative report, share it with others, or contact your representatives, you are pushing back against the machinery of unaccountable power.
Before we go, let's put a fine point on tonight's findings. The United States government is simultaneously downplaying a foreign intelligence threat that endangers its own troops and building a domestic surveillance apparatus that endangers its own elections. These are not separate problems. They are symptoms of a political system that has prioritized the accumulation of surveillance power over the safety and rights of the people it claims to serve.
The question is not whether surveillance technology exists, it does, and it's not going away. The question is whether democratic institutions are strong enough to ensure that surveillance serves the public interest rather than the interests of those who control it. Right now, based on the evidence, the answer is not encouraging.
But that answer is not final. It depends on what we do next, as citizens, as voters, as people who refuse to accept that being watched is the price of being safe. The surveillance state is powerful, but it is not invulnerable. Accountability starts with awareness, and awareness starts with reporting like what we've brought you tonight.
That's our show. I'm Alex Truth. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth doesn't need surveillance to find its way to the light. It just needs people willing to look.
And I'm Maya Clarity. We'll see you next time on Truth Report. Until then, question everything, verify what you can, and never stop demanding answers from the people who hold power. Good night.